Coffee Break Collection 16, Crime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Office for Victims of Crime by the U.S. Department of Justice, April 1993. The Office for Victims of Crime, OVC, is one of 5 agencies within the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. Since it was established in 1985, OVC has served as the federal government's focal point for all issues affecting our nation's crime victims. This role translates into a broad offering of programs and activities designed to help crime victims cope with personal and financial devastation resulting from victimization. With the enactment and subsequent amendments to the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, of 1984 as amended, OVC was given responsibility for administrating the Crime Victims Fund (fund), the primary financial resource for all federally supported victim programs. This unique funding vehicle is the embodiment of legislative justice in the sense that fund deposits for crime victims consist of fines, special penalty assessments, and forfeited appearance and bail bonds paid by defendants convicted of federal crimes. OVC's programs do not rely on the availability of tax dollars, nor will funding for these programs ever increase the national debt. Rather, federal funding for rape crisis hotlines, shelters for battered women, therapy for abused children, and for direct costs, such as medical expenses not covered by insurance, comes from the pockets of kidnappers, bank robbers, drug dealers, and other predators convicted by U.S. attorneys across the country. Through federal fiscal year 1992, over $900 million has been deposited in the Crime Victims Fund and made available for crime victim services. Grant programs. The office funds a variety of formula and discretionary grant programs throughout the country. Formula Grant Program. Approximately 90 to 95% of the Crime Victims Fund is annually awarded to the states and territories for the Crime Victim Compensation and Assistance Formula grant programs. Each program is funded at about the same dollar amount. OVC's State Compensation and Assistance Division is responsible for awarding the formula grants and ensuring that the funds are expended for their legislated purposes. Crime Victim Compensation Program. State-administered crime victim compensation projects help victims and survivors of homicide victims cope with harsh financial realities left in the wake of crime. Commensurable expenses include medical expenses, costs for mental health counseling, lost wages, and funeral expenses. In some states, costs for eyeglasses, corrective lenses, dental service, and prosthetic devices are also covered. The value of this program far exceeds the dollar and cents award amounts to victimized citizens who have incurred compensable expenses. One survivor of a homicide victim who was awarded state compensation for loss of support and funeral expenses recently described the heart of this formula grant program as follows. To the Crime Victim Compensation Board. I'd like to thank the Oklahoma Crime Victim Compensation Board for anything it might award me. When I received the $500 advance, I cried. The relief was great. The bills are quite frightening to someone who has never been alone. I went from childhood to marriage and motherhood, so I've never had to deal with the perils of life by myself. It's just amazing how much it costs just to exist. Even if I don't receive another penny, I'm glad someone cares about the families of victims, because in reality, we have died too. We just haven't been buried yet. Compensation award amounts to the states are equal to 40% of the amount each state distributes in compensation during the prior fiscal year. Thus, federal dollars are used to reinforce each state's proven commitment to providing compensation to crime victims. As part of the grant award process, OVC applies certain minimum eligibility requirements. For example, the state projects are required to compensate victims of federal crime, as well as victims of drunk driving and domestic violence. The states, however, have great discretion in determining their own application procedures and approval criteria, and in setting their own minimum and maximum award amounts. The Crime Victim Compensation Program is an excellent example of a state and federal partnership that works. All states and territories, with the exception of one, participate in this program. Crime Victim Assistance Program. The Victim Assistance Program addresses a wide variety of victim needs. The program makes it possible for victims to attend court hearings by funding the provision for babysitting and transportation services. The program provides victims of domestic violence with shelter when, due to safety concerns, they are forced to leave their homes. It provides abused children with professional therapy. The assistance program furnishes lifeline services to victims at a time in their lives when their sense of reality, security, and physical well-being is abruptly shattered. Of those grants awarded for assistance in 1991, over 12% funded services for child abuse victims. Over 21% funded services for domestic violence victims. Nearly 14% funded services for sexual assault victims. And over 10% supported the provision of services to underserved victims of violent crimes, such as survivors of homicide victims, victims of drunk driving crashes, etc. These areas of funding concentration are consistent with VOCA mandated funding priorities for OVC. Currently, one-third of approximately 7,000 providers of victim assistance throughout the country receive VOCA funding. They are located in churches, hospitals, law enforcement agencies, mental health associations, social services agencies, and prosecutors' offices. The VOCA funding awarded to the state grantees is distributed at the state level through subgrants to direct service providers. While the states must comply with certain minimum funding requirements, they retain great control over the selection of applicants for funding. Each state and territory receives a formula award base amount of $200,000 plus additional distributions based on population size and the total amount available for the assistance program in the Crime Victims Fund. Discretionary grant programs. The purpose of the discretionary grant program is to improve the quality and enhance the availability of victim services. As a discretionary grant funding priority, OVC reaches out to isolated, underserved victim populations in dire need of assistance. Such grants have initiated victim assistance programs on remote Indian reservations and have made services available to sexually exploited children. Discretionary grants also provide training and thereby improve the quality of services rendered by providers of victim assistance. OVC training and technical assistance programs explore emerging issues in the field. They also initiate and expand victim services within criminal justice system components. The discretionary grant programs are administered within OVC by two office divisions, the Federal Crime Victims Division and the Special Projects Division. The Federal Crime Victims Division trains federal criminal justice system personnel and develops programs to handle victims whose cases are handled within the federal criminal justice system. Specific projects administered by this division include Emergency Service Fund, a special fund created to address the need of victims of federal crimes when local resources are unavailable. Victim witness coordinators from the 93 U.S. Attorney's offices access the fund in emergency situations involving victims and witnesses. Services financed through this fund include travel to facilitate participation at trial, emergency shelter, and counseling services. Assistance for Federal Victims of Crime in Indian County Grant Program. A program to establish a permanent network of culturally responsive crime victim assistance programs in Native American communities that are located on federal land areas. Children's Justice Act Discretionary Grant Program for Native Americans. A program designed to improve the investigation and prosecution of child abuse in Indian country so as to limit additional trauma to victims. Training and technical assistance for federal officials. A continuous effort to train federal prosecutors, law enforcement officers, witness victim coordinators, and corrections officials on formulating effective responses to the rights and needs of crime victims. The Special Projects Division, like the Federal Crime Victims Division, designs discretionary grant programs to facilitate a comprehensive, high-quality provision of victim assistance throughout the country. Specifically, this division has administered programs to provide victim assistance to sexually exploited children transported across state lines for illicit purposes, support the investigation and prosecution of child abuse throughout the country, advance victim awareness of civil legal remedies against perpetrators, provide services to address the needs of specific populations, such as Hispanic victims and victims of bias crimes, and enhance the provision of victim services by specific types of social service professionals, such as mental health professionals and the clergy. The Special Projects Division demonstrates its ongoing commitment to implement the recommendations set forth in the President's Task Force on Victims of Crime 1982 final report by working to institutionalize an awareness of victim rights among criminal justice system professionals. OVC-sponsored training and technical assistance projects are now available to law enforcement officers, judges, probation and parole officers, and prosecutors throughout the country. These projects serve to introduce crime victims to criminal justice system professionals as parties of interest who have legitimate concerns deserving of due attention and an effective response. Non-grant related leadership efforts. The office undertakes numerous activities designed to focus public attention on crime victim needs and to advance crime victim rights. Staff members routinely participate in regional public speaking engagements and skills workshops on victim issues. In addition, OVC annually hosts an event during National Crime Victims' Rights Week to honor the accomplishments of outstanding victim advocates. In recent years, selected award recipients have been honored by the President, Attorney General, and Director of OVC at White House Rose Garden ceremonies. With respect to federal legislation, OVC plays a key role in monitoring and facilitating federal agency compliance with statutory mandates affecting victims. The Victim Witness Protection Act of 1982 was the first piece of federal legislation to articulate certain services and minimum rights that should be afforded to crime victims. The 1990 Crime Control Act subsequently outlined the federal government's responsibility for addressing the statutory rights of victims participating in the federal criminal justice system. Specifically, Title V, the Victims' Rights and Restitution Act of 1990 is a Bill of Rights that directs each U.S. agency engaged in the detection, investigation, or prosecution of crime to identify victims of crime and provide specified services. Title II, the Victims of Child Abuse Act of 1990 enables the federal criminal justice system to adapt judicial procedures to address the unique needs and abilities of child victims and witnesses. Through its Federal Crime Victims Division, OVC monitors federal agency compliance with such statutes and reports to both the Attorney General and Congress regarding the status of victim and witness treatment within the federal criminal justice system. OVC is also responsible for coordinating Department of Justice training programs to implement the statutory mandates. Conclusion: OVC plays a pivotal leadership role in the victims' movement. The office supplements, reinforces, and encourages an expansion of state compensation and assistance programs throughout the country. VOCA funding is used by the Office for Victims of Crime to reach out to isolated, often neglected populations of victims, such as sexually exploited children and victims residing on remote Indian reservations. The office also awards grants to sponsor high-quality training and technical assistance on cutting-edge substantive issues of interest to victim advocates, as well as to criminal justice system personnel who regularly interface with victims. These efforts are funded through OVC's formula and discretionary grant program. OVC's leadership role at the federal level also encompasses activities designed to draw public attention to crime victim needs and to promote victim rights through legislation and public policy. In short, the Office for Victims of Crime embraces a multi-dimensional role at the federal level as an advocate for crime victims. For additional information, please contact Office for Victims of Crime, 633 Indiana Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20531, 202-514-6444. End of Office for Victims of Crime by the U.S. Department of Justice, April 1993.